Now, rule 1 says when we join two sentences, we can turn one into a main clause. Main clause is the same as independent clause, okay? And turn the other one into a subordinate clause. I told you earlier, subordinate clause is the same as dependent clause, okay? Now, each one of them, when we turn these two sentences into one, where one part of a sentence is a main clause and the other is a subordinate clause, either of them must contain, both of them must contain a subject and a finite verb. We know what a finite verb is. We dealt extensively with finite verbs when we learned in our lesson on subject and predicates. You can go back there to refresh your memory. I won't dwell on this. I'll just remind you very briefly and move on. We know that finite verbs are those verbs we usually find there. In fact, we always find finite verbs immediately after the subject in a sentence. That is one very good clue. Okay, finite verbs are usually found immediately after the subject in a sentence. Another good clue is they're the ones that change in tense and number depending on the subject given in a sentence, okay? Finite verbs are the ones that change. Non-finite verbs, on the other hand, do not change. They remain the same. You remember when I gave you that tip, okay? So that's it on finite verbs. So each clause, either the main, both the main and the subordinate clause must have a subject and a finite verb. Let's see an example. Here it says, they greeted Mr. Shan. This is a complete sentence, complete thought. It can stand alone. Now this one says, he smiled at them. Another sentence, on its own. It can stand alone. Now the rule says we can join these two sentences and make one the main clause and the other one the subordinate clause using the relative pronoun who. Let's see how they're going to do this. They greeted Mr. Shan, who smiled at them. This is where we demarcated them. They greeted Mr. Shan. You see that this can stand alone. So this is the main clause now. Who smiled at them? You see that this cannot stand alone. So this is the relative clause. This is the subordinate clause. Okay? You can't just say, who smiled at them? What do you mean? Who smiled at them what? Do you understand? But you're going to realize that when this one leans on this, when this dependent clause leans on this independent clause, it brings out the meaning. They greeted Mr. Shan, comma, who smiled at them. Now, this who is referring to Mr. Shan, giving us extra information about him. Remember, I told you relative clauses give extra information about a noun, right? So, this relative clause, beginning with the relative pronoun who, is giving extra information about this noun in this main clause. All right? So, we remove he and we change it to who.